Today we're going to take a look at the interface itself. I'm going to give you a bit of a guided tour of the interface, but I will be glancing over some things so that I can spend more time in detail as we move into future episodes. So the first thing I want to cover is how to open an existing After Effects project. And the easiest thing to do is to come up to your File pull-down menu, and when you click on that, it reveals this menu. We're going to go into the Open Project choice. Now, throughout the series, you'll be able to download all of the project files for each episode, and they'll be laid out in the following format. You will have an AEP file, which is an After Effects project file, and then you'll also have a footage folder which contains any assets that may be used in the project. So what we're going to do is just highlight the guided tour version 01. This is in the Getting Started project folder, and just click Open. And what you'll see is our After Effects project. It's just a very basic project. I put it together simply so that it can put it into context as we move around the interface. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that there are multiple ways to do the same thing in After Effects, and this is not dissimilar to a lot of other Adobe applications. I'll give you a good example. Say I want to import some footage, and I'm going to cover that in more detail shortly, but I could right click over here in an empty space in the project folder, and I could say import file. I could also come up to File, import file in the pull down menus. I could also double click in a gap or a space in the project folder, and it brings up an import file browser as well. So there are three distinctly different ways to do exactly the same thing in After Effects. So during this 10-part series, you will see me using specific ways, and I'm not always going to go into the multiple ways to do the same thing. I'm usually going to use the most efficient way, so definitely explore the multiple ways to do certain things in After Effects, and bear that in mind as we move through the interface. So we'll start at the top. We have our pull-down menus across the top, and many of these pull-down menus have the same functionality in our right-click context sensitive menu. If I right click anywhere in the viewport, it brings up this context sensitive. Notice that where I click is slightly different. The menu itself is slightly different. The file pull down menu has all of the features relating to the actual file itself: file open, export, import, those sorts of things, collecting files. We're going to run into a lot of these things in more detail in future episodes. We've got our edit menu, which has many of our cut, copy, paste, duplicate, split layers. These are definitely specific to editing an asset or a layer. We have our composition menu. This is very important. It's where we can create new compositions. We can also manipulate the composition, and we can set up RAM previews. We can also save out still frame renders, and we're going to cover these in more detail shortly. We have our layer menu, which is specific to layers in our compositions, and I'm going to explain exactly how layers work later on in this episode. We've got our effects menu. Now, without the effects menu, After Effects just really wouldn't be very useful to people. The heart of After Effects is really all of these effects, but you'll see here that we have sub-menus, 3D channels. These are all of the 3D channel related effects. I've got generate. These are all the generate related effects down here. Text. We've got a couple of text related, and so on. So these are organized into very easy to follow sub-menus. We'll cover that in an entire episode dedicated to effects coming up. I've got my animation menu. Now this is something that we're going to really dedicate a lot of time to in the animation episode. You can go into the keyframe assistant, and there's also some sub-menus that we can explore here as well, and this will become a lot more apparent when we move into animation. Your view is relative to your interface, and we can zoom in, zoom out of viewers, and we can set up guides similar to Photoshop, and many of these things I'll be using as we step through the rest of the series. Now, window is really about setting up your workspace, and you can see that anything that's ticked is currently visible in the current session. I've got a preview window, which is this window here, and down here I've got a composition window, which is this window down here, and I'm going to cover this in more detail shortly. And the final one is your help pull down menu. Now, it can't be understated, the help system in After Effects is absolutely fantastic. And the guys over at Adobe that look after the help system for After Effects are state of the art. They They have a very healthy community of users that contribute their experiences and, in many instances, their tutorials, their links to the help system. So the community-based help system in After Effects is outstanding, but the Adobe-driven After Effects help system is also outstanding as well. And my good friend Todd Capriva over at After Effects has really done a fantastic job, and I believe that much of the success for After Effects goes towards what a fantastic job they've done with the support that comes with After Effects through its help system. So definitely do not underestimate it. One worth mentioning in this menu is the keyboard shortcuts. Now, after a while of using After Effects, you'll start to realize how important it is to learn various keyboard shortcuts. And if you click on the keyboard shortcuts menu, it's a web-based menu that allows you to basically browse all of the available keyboard shortcuts that are currently implemented in After Effects. So let's keep working our way down, and we have our toolbar across the top here, and I'll certainly be going into many of the features in the toolbar as they are more applicable to the task that we're covering at the time. But probably the first little section here is worth noting. The first one is your selection tool, which allows you to select various objects. With the selection tool, I can select and move assets within my compositions, as opposed to the hand tool, which allows me to move the composition around in the viewport to allow me to better see my composition and my assets. And the next one is the zoom tool, which allows me to click and draw a marquee, and that will zoom into there. And I can also hold Alt and zoom out in the same manner. In relation to the zoom tool, you can also use your middle mouse wheel. If your mouse has a middle wheel, you can roll your middle mouse wheel in and out, and you don't need to be in the magnification tool or the zoom tool. You can be in any one of these, or any tool in fact will allow you to roll in and out. If you click and hold the middle mouse button, it will turn into the hand tool and allow you to move about in the viewport. So the middle mouse button starts to become very important to working your way around the interface. The rest of these tools I'm going to cover in more detail when they're more applicable to the specific areas of After Effects that I'll be covering in future episodes. So we move our way down. This is the project window or the project panel, and it is absolutely crucial for you to understand exactly how this project window works. This is where we store all of the assets for an After Effects project. And you can see in this dummy composition here that we have some assets. I've got a gas refinery background piece of footage here. I've also got an After Effects logo, and I've got a composition. It's important to recognize that each one of these has a different logo next to the word, and that logo is relative to what type of asset it is. The top one is a composition logo, and I'm going to explain compositions in a future episode in a lot of detail. They're very powerful. And this one's a still image, and you can see it's just got a picture of a still image. And this one's a QuickTime logo, because if you look up here, the asset tells me that it's a H.264, and that's represented by a QuickTime logo given my current Windows build. I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail shortly. I do have some icons down the bottom of my project window which are quite important. I've got my interpret footage. I'm going to cover that in detail shortly. I've got a create folder. When I click on that, it allows me to create a folder. I could certainly just grab all of my assets and group them up into a folder. This seems a little bit overkill for having 3 assets, but when you have hundreds of assets, and that is very common for After Effects, having a very organized project window is crucial to understanding where all of your assets are and to minimize making mistakes. Next one is the composition, and that allows me to actually click and create a composition. Pops up this composition window. I'm going to cover that in a lot more detail in our next episode. And then I've just got a bit depth here. I'm going to cover that in detail in a future episode as well. By default, it's set to 8 bits per channel, and we can do 16 bits per channel and 32 bits per channel, and that'll become a little bit more apparent when we move on to understanding channels and bit depth. And there's also a delete selected project items trash can item here. So if I just highlight an item, hit the trash can, it will delete it. It'll ask to confirm it, and it's no longer in my project. I'll just undo that. Incidentally, if you wish to undo something in the interface, you can go edit and undo, but you'll notice here that there are shortcut or hotkey combinations for common functions in After Effects. Any of these you will use over and over again. So Control Z is the shortcut key to undo my last task. So I'm just going to hit Control Z, and you'll see now that my gas refinery footage is back. We keep moving. Here we have our viewer. This is currently set to be my composition viewer, and in your composition viewer it allows me to see what is happening down on my composition timeline. This is my composition timeline. I'll get to it shortly, but up in the viewer here, if I was to double click on an asset over here, double click, you'll notice it opens up a new viewer. It's tabbed the new viewer and it says the word footage, as opposed, and notice that there is no After Effects logo here because I'm literally just looking at the gas refinery preview render, which is this one asset here in my project window, as opposed to my composition viewer, which has any layers that are in my composition are visible here, and that'll become a lot more apparent when I explain compositions shortly. So I'm just going to close this by clicking on the X here. That closes down that viewer. So at any time I can double click on an asset to see what exactly that asset looks like on its own without looking at it in a composition viewer. So I'll just close that down. The features along the bottom here I'm going to cover in a lot more detail when we have a look at an introductory project, but the one or two that I will cover in this session is the view magnification ratio. At the moment it's set to 50%. If I use my middle mouse button, you'll see that number change to 100%. And if I go in the other direction, that number is getting smaller until I can go all the way down to 1.5% magnification. It's important to note that I'm not changing the size of my composition. I'm literally looking at it closer or further away. And I can also bring this down arrow menu up and use fit to 100%. Now what this means is I can grab my window here and move it, and it will resize relative to whatever size I make this window. It will literally fill it until it's at 100%. And then once it's at 100%, it will stay at 100%. And then as I go smaller, it will scale down. Now while I'm on that, you can start to reshape your interface to suit your workflow and to suit what you're doing in After Effects at the time. We do this by just putting our cursor over these lines, and you'll see the cursor will change and show you what you can actually do. In this instance, I can go left and right and change the size of both of the windows to the left and to the right of this line. Down here, I can go up and down. And if I go to a point, say here, I can actually move multiple dimensions and change all three windows that intersect at that intersection here. I can do the same down here and resize all three windows. So being able to manipulate the interface is a very strong, powerful part of After Effects, and we use it a lot in the After Effects world to really maximize the real estate, the screen real estate that's available to us, to really be able to focus on what we're working on at the time. We'll keep moving across here. This is your time code here, current time code, and at the moment you'll see down here my composition window, which I'll cover shortly. It's set to hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, but if I hold down Control and click on this yellow number, it will change to frames. Also, it changes up here to frames, so that as I move along the timeline, that number will be an absolute frame number along this timeline. If I Control click to revert back, you'll see that as I move along, it's hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. And we'll cover that in a lot more detail when we get to compositions and how they work. The next one, full, half, third, and quarter relate to the quality of this window. Now, if you have a limited resource system where you have low amount of RAM and your processor is actually a little bit old, you may find that as you start to work in a very complex composition that you will run into some lagging and very non-responsive timeline down here. What we can actually do is set a lower resolution in the preview window. That's set to a quarter, and as you can see, it's very difficult for me to actually see any detail in the piece, but it's ideal for having a look at just movement of assets in a motion graphic sense. A quarter's fine for animation, for most animation. Maybe a third is probably a little bit more practical. but certainly use whichever level of quality in the viewer that is relative to your resources. The active camera I'm going to cover in a lot more detail, especially when we move into 3D and the 3D capabilities in After Effects. So we're going to leave that for this session. The next one is quite important. Basically what this is relative to your graphics card. Depending on what type of graphics card you can have an adaptive resolution. If I leave that on adaptive resolution and I start to slide around in the viewport and it starts to get very heavy, what it will do is down res automatically the resolution. It's a bit hard to see because I do have quite a powerful machine at the moment, but later on you'll see that you may run into this where your images start to get very pixelated as you scrub on the timeline. What you can do is just switch off your adaptive resolution, and it'll slow things down on the timeline, but you'll at least be able to see a true representation of what your project actually looks like. I'm going to leave the next couple until we get to a little bit of workflow tips later on. The last one here is your exposure controls, and your exposure controls are very important as we start to use this environment for compositing and visual effects. To be able to ramp up your exposure allows you to see what areas are the darkest areas in the image, and if we ramp down the exposure we can see what the brightest areas of the image are, and by clicking this button here we can reset it back to the standard default setting. And it's important to note that all we're doing is affecting the viewer. We're not actually affecting our project. If I was to render out our project and finalize the project, then it certainly wouldn't look like this. This is just the viewer that we're playing with here. So I'm moving now over to the info window. By the way, we're currently looking at the standard out-of-the-box After Effects workspace. And you can see up the top here it says standard, and if I use my window pull-down menu, it has a workspace section, and then you can see that standard is actually ticked. All of these other workspaces are actually thrown in by Adobe to represent a better workspace for working with specific types of projects in After Effects. If you, for instance, have an animation project and you click on the animation workspace, you'll see that the features that come up here, the smoother, wiggler, motion sketch, they're more related to animation and the sorts of animation work or tools that you need for animation work. I'm just going to revert back to my standard workspace and I'll show you exactly how this works. If I was to manipulate the workspace here at the moment and then reset back to standard, nothing actually happens. What can happen, because I'm in standard mode, is you can manipulate this workspace and you may wish to revert back to the original standard. All you do is go up to Window, Workspace, and reset standard. And what that does is it resets it back to the out-of-the-box Adobe After Effects standard workspace, which is very valuable if you've made a bit of a mess of your workspace and you just want to tidy it up and get it back to normal. So what you're looking at, all of the panels that are available here are available in the standard workspace. I have an info panel, gives me information as I move my cursor around my composition or my viewer. I've got my audio panel, and you'll see that if I was to play back here, we will get an audio reading here in the left and right. I've also got a preview window here, which is usually left in the interface so that you can use these play buttons. These are basically your play, your RAM preview buttons. Now, it's important to note that when you press play in After Effects, you quite often are not looking at a real-time playback unless you see this green bar along your composition timeline down here, which means that it has in fact RAM previewed or calculated all of the effects and all of the layers and animation into RAM, and now I'm looking at a real-time playback. But it's much safer to use the RAM preview button over here because it will do the RAM processing. The green bar will fill up, and then once it's full, it will play back at real time. It will also play back audio. You'll notice when you press play, you won't get audio, but when you RAM preview, you will actually get audio in the playback if you do have audio in your composition. There's some other features in the preview window that I'll cover in a little bit more detail in a future episode, which leads us down to the effects and presets. We tend to avoid these when we're working on professional productions, but they're a fantastic place to start understanding how effects and animation works in After Effects. By applying many of these, you will be able to see how they actually work by reverse engineering how they've been applied to the footage. So I'm going to leave them for now. We're going to be using them in our first introductory project, which will be in our next episode. And that brings us down to our comp section down here, which is our composition. Basically, you have your timeline here. You've got your layers that make up the composition. And similar to Photoshop, the layer dominance system works. If I was to bring this logo underneath the gas field preview render, it would disappear because it is no longer on top. Whereas if I grab the gas field logo, you'll see that it is there, but it's just not visible because of the layer dominance. Later on, I'll show you some 3D in After Effects which sort of overrides this process, but for now, just remember that there is a layer dominance in your compositions, and the layers or assets that are on top are revealed over the top of the layers or assets that are underneath. So I'm going to cover this in a lot more detail shortly. Now, this composition is represented up in my project window by this icon here. And if I was to rename this asset in my project window by hitting enter on my keyboard, I'm just going to call this main comp. You'll see it renamed down here in this tab. Now, before we leave the interface, what I'm going to do is show you how to customize the interface a little bit. You'll notice that every panel has these two dotted lines in the top left corner. And what they are grab handles for you to change or manipulate or move this panel around the interface. Now, I could grab this and drag it down here. You'll notice there's a context sensitive interface that shows me where I can grab it and put it. If I put it, say, here, what'll happen is it'll place it side by side with the audio window here. If I grab it and put it, say, in the middle, they'll be tabbed together so that I can select them on the tab. If I grab this and place it at the bottom, then I now have these top and bottom. I can also grab this and pull it over, say, here, and now I have it between these two here. So it's important to understand how this process works because it really does affect the way you work in After Effects to really maximize how to get your workspace as productive as possible. I'll just place this one back where it was. And similar to this interactive process here, if I go to the very top, you'll notice it turns green, and that will place it all the way across the top of the window there. And I might as well manipulate a little bit here. I'm going to grab my preview window. I'm going to grab it and stick it right at the very top so that I have my controls available at the top there. And I'm just going to go into my window, workspace, new workspace. And I'm going to go Dave VO1 workspace, go OK, and now you'll see in my window workspace menu I have a new workspace. If I reset back to standard and then make sure that the standard is actually the Adobe standard, there it is there, and at any time I can go back to my workspace, Dave version 01, and there it is exactly as I left it. This is fantastic for when you have dual monitors. You can set up your tools on one monitor and your viewers on the other, or the timeline and the viewer on the other. You can save that as a workspace dual monitor and then refer to that whenever you're working with dual monitors. So please take the time to have a look at how workspaces work in After Effects and put together something that you're comfortable working with. So before we move on, let's have a look at how we can add some assets to our composition here. What I'm going to do is right click anywhere in the project window here. We'll bring up this little context sensitive menu that allows me to import files. Now I can import a file, a single file. I can import multiple files, but I can also import Adobe Premiere projects, and I can also import placeholders, solids. So there's a few choices there. One that's worth paying attention to is the fact that I can actually import an Adobe Premiere Pro project. So they are completely interoperable. I can work the other way by opening an After Effects project in Adobe Premiere as well. It's not completely compatible when it comes to certain effects, but it's definitely worth having a look at to really get the best out of both applications together. I'm just going to click on the File menu, which brings up a browser, and I might just grab this MP3 file and bring it in. It's showing a little cone here because it's referring to my VLC player, which is currently my default player for MP3 files on my system. So many of the icons that will show up in your project window depend on what the default player is for your current build of Windows. Like I mentioned before, my MP4s are set up to automatically play in a QuickTime viewer, and that's why it gets a QuickTime logo here. So here is my new MP3. If I double click on it, I can view it by clicking on my RAM preview. And you can see there that it's visible that it's playing back. And you'll see up the top here also that it's declared it as footage and it's opened up a new window of its own. And this would happen if I was to double click on any of the assets that have been imported into the project window. So I'm just going to close that down. And what I'm going to do is grab this and just drag it down and stick it underneath my gas refinery. And notice that I have two speaker icons here. That means I've got audio on both of those assets. They have come into After Effects with audio on them, and currently that audio is switched on by having the two speaker icons here. What I'm going to do is switch off the speaker icon by clicking on it, and that toggles it and it's no longer visible. And now if I play this composition, I get the imported didgeridoo audio instead of the original audio that came in with the MP4. I'm just going to grab that layer now and delete it by hitting the delete button on my keyboard, or I can come up to my edit pull down menu and I can clear, which takes it out of the main comp. It's still available in the project window. So let's have a quick chat about how this project window works and how projects work in After Effects. You'll notice here, if I drag this out, we can see that there is more information available in this project window, including the size of the assets and the type of asset. It's also color coded here with labels, which we can click on that label there and change it to whatever color code we want. And there's also a file path. Now this is actually very important for you to understand. If I was to click File, Open Project, I'm just going to click Don't Save here. This is the actual file that we're working in at the moment, and you'll notice the size of it is 77 kilobytes. Now if I close that, so I'm just going to open that up, 77 kilobytes, and go open. I'm just going to drag this across. Notice that it has a gas refinery preview render that is 1.3 megabytes plus the 44 kilobytes of the logo itself. Something doesn't gel. How can it be 77 kilobytes for the After Effects project file, yet it has an asset in it that is much bigger? It's in fact 1.3 megabytes. Well, the simple fact is, assets that are in After Effects are not actually brought into After Effects the way you would expect assets to be brought into, say, Photoshop. When you create a Photoshop file, every time you add image data like a JPEG or a piece of a JPEG from another source, what you're doing is adding that JPEG to the actual Photoshop file, and the Photoshop file keeps growing and growing and growing and actually gets quite large. I've worked on Photoshop files that are over a gig in size. Well, After Effects doesn't work that way. What it actually does is it uses the asset in the composition, it uses the asset in whatever work that you're doing, but it doesn't actually import it into the work. What it does is it references the asset into the work, and that's why this file path becomes very, very important. The After Effects logo here is currently located in a specific location or path that After Effects understands where to get it, and therefore it can be used, and we can see it here. But if I was to bring up the actual location that it is referring to and take the After Effects logo and let's change it to, let's call it AE logo old to rename it. It renames it with no problems whatsoever, and back in After Effects nothing seems different until I try to access it, and then it pops up with this that says it can no longer or could not be found. So if I go OK to that, you'll notice the logo up in the top here, or the little preview window, is showing these color bars. That's what you'll get when it can no longer find the asset. And if I drag across and show you, it says missing. If I give myself a little bit more space here, it says missing, and it tells me where it should be, but it's no longer there, or something has happened to it. So what this basically means is it's very important when you're working in After Effects to not rename, move, or delete assets that have been brought in to an After Effects project, because what you're doing is you're changing the path, and as soon as the path changes, it can no longer use that asset. So that's the downside, and you do have to be very cautious of it. As long as you're aware of it, there's no major issues. But the positive to it is none of these assets that I bring in here, the original asset doesn't change. All I'm doing is manipulating it within After Effects. The original asset, the After Effects logo, stays exactly the way it was when it first got brought into After Effects. And if I was to do a bunch of work to it, change it, manipulate it, squash it, render it out, the After Effects logo is going to remain exactly the same. So it's a very non-destructive way of working, which is a fantastic asset that After Effects has. So I'm just going to change that back. Just going to rename that back to AE logo. Now all I need to do is right click, and I can either reload footage, or I can even just replace footage just to make sure I'm in the right location. Just go File and navigate to the exact location. We're now getting started footage. Click the AE logo JPEG and go OK, and there's our logo back, and you'll see that the path now no longer says that it's missing, and everything is found in the project. So understanding how assets work in the project is very important, and maintaining and managing those assets outside of After Effects is also very important, or at least have a good understanding of how things will be affected if you start moving, renaming, or deleting assets within the Windows environment. Now the last thing I wanted to cover is understanding the properties section up here. If you highlight an asset, you get some very valuable information up next to this little icon, or this little preview window here. For starters, the preview window, notice that it's got a little sound wave underneath the image. That means that the icon actually has audio, and it also is mentioned down here in this bottom line, which mentions 48 kilohertz, 32-bit stereo is the audio settings for this particular MP4 file. It tells me what type of MP4 it is, and it's a H.264 codec. We're going to get to codecs later on in the series. It tells me that it has millions of colors plus. It also tells me that it is 10 seconds long, 10 seconds and 1 frame to be exact. And if I was to control click once again down here on my time code, that will change to absolute frame count, which is 251 frames long. It's frame rate, which is frames per second. So every second there are 25 frames. It tells me the resolution, which is 720 by 404. And it also tells me whether these pixels are square or not. Now at the moment it's 1.00, which tells me that the pixels are perfectly square. It also tells me at the top the name of the asset, the true name of the asset, and it also tells me how many times it has been used in the current project. It's been used 1 time. If I select the JPEG, you'll see that I get different information. Millions of colors plus, there's no audio, there's the resolution and the pixel aspect ratio, there's no codec information. So this information up here is absolutely specific to the layer that I have selected at the time, and I can even do that for compositions as well, and it tells me the length of the composition, the frames per second, and the size and pixel aspect ratio of the composition. So it's a fantastic feature to be able to highlight quickly your assets and see all of this information. It really helps when knowing how to implement the asset down into your compositions and into your composition workflows. That's going to do it for our introduction to the interface and our guided tour. As I mentioned, I did skip over quite a few things that I'm going to spend a lot more time in detail when I get to those various aspects in future episodes. So don't panic if there's certain areas that look like I didn't include, and certainly don't panic if I've used language. I may have mentioned a term that you've never heard before. It will be definitely explained in more detail as we move forward. Now, That doesn't mean that you can't refer to the help system that I showed you earlier if you want to get a head start on understanding some of the lingo, some of the terminology that I've used that you might not be familiar with. I do suggest that you have a look at the help system just to see what's available for you if you're starting out in After Effects, because if you have too many headaches and too many brick walls, you won't turn to After Effects as a useful tool for creative projects. So we want to avoid that by making sure that we have a good understanding of where to find the information, and the help community is a fantastic resource in that instance. So that's it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at an introductory project. Let's just say we're going to dive in the deep end. We're going to do a project from scratch, and that'll give us a good hands-on feel for a lot of the tools that we use over and over again in our After Effects workflow. That's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.